A hidden room. Behind a wall that was not supposed to be there. Files stacked with military precision. Documents dated the day before.
On July 24th, 2025, a phone rang inside a quiet home in Clearwater, Florida. A 911 dispatcher heard the words cardiac arrest. Within minutes, paramedics were working on a man whose body had spent 5 decades being slammed, thrown, cut open, and rebuilt in front of millions of people. Less than 2 hours later, at 11:17 in the morning, doctors at Morton Plant Hospital pronounced him dead. Terry Gene Bollea, the man the world knew as Hulk Hogan, was gone at 71. And almost immediately, the internet did what it always does. It went looking for a room, a secret, a conspiracy hiding behind the official story. But the real story of Hulk Hogan's final years doesn't need an invented hidden room to be extraordinary, because behind the headline of a heart attack was a man carrying more than anyone outside his inner circle understood, a body barely holding together, a family split down the middle, and a legacy so enormous that even his death felt like it needed a bigger explanation than the truth actually was. Let's start with what actually happened that morning, because it matters. According to the Clearwater Police Department's own final report, officers responded to the 911 call at 9:51 a.m. 2 people were already in the house, Hogan's wife, Sky Daly, and a home health aide, along with an occupational therapist who had arrived just minutes earlier for a scheduled session. All 3 of them performed CPR before the fire department got there. That's not the scene of cover-up. That's the scene of ordinary people trying desperately to save someone's life. Hogan was rushed to the hospital and pronounced dead less than 90 minutes after the call came in. The Pinellas County Medical Examiner's office later confirmed the cause of death as acute myocardial infarction, a heart attack, and ruled the manner of death natural. Months later, when the Clearwater Police Department closed its case, it stated plainly that there was no evidence of criminal wrongdoing. A private autopsy, separately commissioned, reached the same conclusion. He died from natural disease, with no signs of trauma or toxicology involved. That's not a headline built to satisfy conspiracy theorists. It's just the truth, and sometimes the truth is simply sad. But natural causes doesn't mean simple. To understand how a heart attack could take down a man who once seemed indestructible, you have to understand what his body had actually been through. In an interview on Jake Paul's podcast less than a year before he died, Hogan said openly that he'd had 25 surgeries in the previous 10 years alone. 10 of them were on his back. He'd had both shoulders operated on, both hips replaced, both knees rebuilt. He talked candidly about the old-school wrestling rings of the 1970s, rings with exposed boards and hard corners, nothing like the padded, engineered rings of today, and how those early years had quietly written a bill that his body would spend the rest of his life paying off. He had also lived for years with atrial fibrillation, an irregular heart rhythm that raises the risk of exactly the kind of cardiac event that ultimately killed him. And medical records released after his death confirmed something the public didn't know at all. Hogan had been quietly battling chronic lymphocytic leukemia, a slow-moving blood cancer, in the background of his final years. None of this was hidden in a secret basement room. It was hidden in plain sight, in doctors' offices and operating rooms, behind the sunglasses and the handlebar mustache and the bravado that had defined him since the 1980s. To really feel the weight of that ending, you have to go back to the beginning, to understand what Hulk Hogan actually built, because it's easy to forget just how singular his impact was. Before Hogan, professional wrestling was regional entertainment, filling out small arenas and local television slots, treated by most of the country as a niche curiosity. Hogan didn't just perform in that world. He blew the walls off it, with his shirt-ripping entrances, his 24-inch pythons, and a promise to every kid watching that they should train, say their prayers, and take their vitamins. He turned himself into something closer to a cartoon superhero than an athlete. And that was entirely the point. In 1985, he was the headline act of the very first WrestleMania, the event that would eventually become the Super Bowl of professional wrestling. 2 years later, at WrestleMania 3 in the Pontiac Silverdome, in front of a crowd announced at 93,000 people, he body-slammed Andre the Giant, a nearly 7-foot, 500-pound legend who almost never allowed himself to be slammed by anyone. That single moment became one of the most replayed images in the history of American sports entertainment. It wasn't just a wrestling spot. It was the moment Hulkamania stopped being a slogan and became a genuine cultural phenomenon, one that helped drag pro wrestling out of smoky regional territories and into primetime, mainstream, global entertainment. He didn't stop at wrestling. Hogan crossed over into movies, cartoons, and eventually reality television with Hogan Knows Best, a show that let cameras into what looked, from the outside, like the picture-perfect American family. Hogan, his wife Linda, and their two kids, Brooke and Nick. For years, that image was as much a part of his brand as the 24-inch pythons. And for years, it was largely real. But in 2007, that world cracked open. Infidelity allegations surfaced, and Linda filed for divorce after 24 years of marriage. What followed was messy, public, and financially brutal. The kind of divorce that plays out not just in courtrooms, but in tabloid headlines and reality show reruns that suddenly felt like evidence in a trial the whole country was watching. Hogan later admitted, in his own words, that the depression he felt during that period pushed him to a genuinely dark place. That's not a small confession from a man whose entire public identity had been built on being unbreakable. It's a reminder that the same body that could take a body slam from a giant could still be brought to its knees by grief and humiliation that had nothing to do with wrestling at all. His family story never fully healed after that. Hogan remarried in 2010 to Jennifer McDaniel, and that marriage quietly ended a decade later. In 2023, he married Sky Daly, a yoga instructor, in a relationship that moved quickly enough to raise eyebrows among people close to him. But by all public accounts, she became a steadying presence in his final years. In her own statement after his death, Sky Daly described being shocked, saying she believed he still had more time, and calling him, simply, "My Terry." Meanwhile, his relationship with his daughter Brooke had grown distant over the years, strained by old scandals, including a deeply personal leaked recording that Brooke has said caused her real and lasting pain. She stepped back from many public family moments, including, notably, his wedding to Sky Daly. His son Nick, by contrast, remained closely involved in his life. None of that is a mystery hidden behind a wall. It's just what happens to a lot of families when fame, money, scandal, and time all collide at once. A slow drifting apart that has nothing cinematic about it. Only the quiet, familiar sadness of relationships that used to be simple becoming complicated. So why, within days of his death, did so much of the internet reach for something darker? A hidden room, a mystery phone call, a federal cover-up? Partly because Hogan's life was, by any measure, larger than life, and it's genuinely hard for our brains to accept that a man that big could be taken down by something as ordinary as a heart attack. Partly because true crime and conspiracy content performs extremely well online, and a beloved celebrity's sudden death is exactly the kind of event algorithms and audiences both reward with attention. And partly, honestly, because grief looks for meaning, and a mystery feels more meaningful than a diagnosis. But none of that makes the invented version true. There's no verified reporting, not from Clearwater Police, not from the medical examiner's office, not from any credible news organization, of a hidden basement room, a disabled security system, an untraceable warning call, or an FBI investigation into his death. Those elements don't appear in the police report that closed the case. They don't appear in the medical examiner's findings. They exist only in speculative online content built to generate clicks off a tragedy that was already sad enough on its own. What we do know, from the actual public record, tells its own powerful story. No embellishment required. We know Hogan trained his entire adult life inside a body that steadily accumulated damage most people would never willingly endure. We know he kept performing, kept showing up, kept being Hulk Hogan in public long after the private cost of that persona had become enormous. We know his family, like so many families touched by fame and scandal, fractured in places and held together in others, right up until the end. We know that when he collapsed, the people around him, his wife, a home health aide, a therapist who'd barely met him, didn't hesitate. They dropped everything and tried to bring him back. And we know that when investigators finally closed the book on how he died, the answer wasn't scandal. It was simply this: a 71-year-old man, carrying decades of physical damage and an undisclosed cancer diagnosis on top of it, suffered a heart attack his body could not survive. There's a reason that answer, even without any hidden room, still feels enormous. Because the real story of Hulk Hogan's death isn't about what was concealed. It's about what wrestling fans have always sensed, but rarely said out loud, that the larger-than-life characters who make that sport so thrilling are paying a very real, very human price behind the curtain. Every body slam Hogan gave and took across more than 4 decades left a mark that didn't show up on television. Every surgery he mentioned so casually on a podcast represented months of pain most of us will never understand. The hidden room in Hulk Hogan's story was never a basement in Clearwater. It was the distance between the invincible character the world watched for 40 years and the very breakable man underneath it, quietly absorbing the cost of that character every single day, right up until his heart finally couldn't carry it anymore. His legacy, though, doesn't need a conspiracy to make it matter. In Clearwater, murals of him still cover the walls of local businesses. Fans still leave flowers and photographs at makeshift memorials, remembering not just the wrestler, but the man who made that community part of his life for real, not just for cameras. Wrestlers who came after him, from Dwayne Johnson to John Cena, to an entire generation of performers who grew up idolizing him, have said plainly that without Hulk Hogan, the industry they built their own careers on simply wouldn't exist in the same form. He took a regional curiosity and turned it into a global phenomenon. And virtually every wrestler who has filled an arena since owes some part of that opportunity to the path he cut open in the 1980s. So maybe the most honest way to close this story is the simplest one. Hulk Hogan did not die because of a secret buried in a hidden room. He died the way a lot of people who push their bodies to extraordinary limits eventually do, worn down by decades of accumulated damage, carrying a serious illness the public never fully knew about, in the arms of people who loved him and fought to save him until the very end. That's not a smaller story than the one the internet invented. In a lot of ways, it's a bigger one, because it's true, and because it's the story of an ordinary human caught hiding underneath an extraordinary public legend. Hulk Hogan spent his career convincing the world that one man could seem bigger than life itself. The real tragedy, and the real lesson, is that in the end, none of us actually are.